Good morning, everybody. Quick show of hands, how many people saw me speak the last time? Just want to see. Okay, so about a third. So we get a bunch of new faces. That's great. I want to give a big thank you to Innovate Pasadena, and another thank you to Cross Campus. This is a wonderful space. Let's get more members in Cross Campus soon. It's really nice to have them in Pasadena. Let's see, where's my clicker here? Okay, so I want to talk about scope growth, budget surprise, scope creep. I had a bit of trouble naming this presentation because what I'm talking about is a little bit broader than just the strict concept of scope creep. Let's see another show of hands. How many of you have been part of or seen a software project that started off expecting to spend a certain amount of money and ended up expecting to spend more than that? Show of hands. So that's more than half the people in the room. Another show of hands, how many of you have an impression that this is a bigger problem in software than in other industries? And about a third of the room. Well, I think that's probably a well-deserved stigma in the software industry. It is a problem, and we're going to talk about how it happens and how to control it. So this is the phenomenon we're trying to control. You've got some estimate of what you're going to spend on your software, and you're going to end up spending some larger amount. And what I want to talk about is budget surprise. So I'm using the term budget surprise because it encompasses more than just scope creep. Let's break this down into a couple of subcategories. So the first one is incorrect estimates. So this is not that your scope grew, this is that your estimate of the original scope was an incorrect financial estimate. And that's why I'm using a term broader than scope creep. Scope creep is the second problem, where what you were planning to build is not what you ended up building. You ended up adding to it along the way. And then there's a third one that I'm going to call the endpoint fallacy. So let's go through these three in order and discuss the things that contribute to them. So incorrect estimates. In my experience, I've been part of about 50 software projects over the last 20 years. This contributes to about 10 to 13% of budget surprise. So you end up spending as much as 30% more than you originally estimated. And the problem was that the estimate was incorrect. So why was your estimate too low? I'm going to put it into two subcategories. The first one are psychological factors. So these are mental reasons why our estimate didn't come out right. The first one is optimism, pure and simple. You've probably heard the term the planning fallacy. If not, I suggest you go look at the Wikipedia page, start there and follow it to the research. The research has been going on for 40 years. It's very well established. It's kind of depressing, but it's important to know. The simple fact is humans are optimistic about their abilities to do things. Almost everybody underestimates how much time it's going to take. More importantly, even knowing that fact, people still underestimate. Even having done a task before and having observed that they underestimated, they still underestimate it the next time. And even having done that and knowing about the planning fallacy and trying to take that into account by padding the estimates, they still underestimate. This is a universal problem for all people. The research, the psychological research about it is pretty much a slam dunk. So we can't just trick ourselves into making an estimate accurate. We have to use tools to solve this problem. All right, so the second one is a desire to please. So everything I'm going to tell you today applies to both kinds of developers. I'm coming from the perspective of an outside contractor that you might have hired to work for your company. But everything is just as applicable to internal developers that you have hired and are paying a salary. One of the important factors, psychological factors for both kinds of developers is they want to make you happy. So this is an implicit incentive to try and give a more optimistic estimate. You ask the developer, how much time is it going to take to build this? How much is it going to cost? They want to give you an answer that is going to make you smile. That is very hard to fight against when you're trying to come up with an accurate estimate. And it adds to the optimism fallacy to improve the likelihood, improve is maybe not the perfect word, improve the likelihood that the estimate is over-optimistic. And the third one is, let's be honest, there's bid competition. When you are shopping around for developers, you're going to be asking for estimates from every developer, and those people know that they are trying to win your business. Now, I think no reputable development company is going to intentionally give you a low estimate to try and win your business. But nonetheless, incentives matter. And when incentives are in the back of our head, people will rationalize things, often without even being aware of it. They'll completely subconsciously rationalize a different estimate in an attempt to win your business. So those are the psychological factors that contribute to an estimate being incorrect. Most of those fall more on the developer's responsibility, but you as a purchaser can do things to affect that, and we'll talk about those when we get to the solutions part of the talk. The second category of incorrect estimates are a loose grouping of things that I'm going to call planning failures. So the first planning failure is unexpected technical difficulty, just like we were having here with the clicker at the beginning of the presentation. So this is the effect where you estimate how difficult a task is going to be based on experience of similar tasks, but one of the challenges with software is the software world changes so fast, and everything we build is something nobody's ever built before. So we're going to run into things that nobody anticipated and nobody could have anticipated. This is probably the effect towards budget surprise that you can do the least about. As an example, we were working for a client one time who needed to use an external data provider. It was one we hadn't worked with before. It was an external API that provided data on consumers. In order to estimate its difficulty, we looked at their documentation. We found it was similar to other things we had used before. And so based on their data format, we estimated probably 10 to 15 hours to integrate it into this client's project. When we started using it, we discovered that yes, the data format was correctly documented, but the data supplier took 5 minutes to return results. This required us to build a whole architecture to handle delayed jobs and integrate that data later when it came back and show a placeholder to the user in the meantime. And so instead of 15 hours, it took us 40. That sort of thing happens at least 2 or 3 times in every software project. And the bigger the software project, the more it will happen. So we need to budget for the unexpected technical difficulties because there's really nothing we can do to anticipate them. That's the definition of unexpected. Okay, the next one is technical debt. This is the subject of my last talk. I encourage you to go online and look at it. In short, it's basically software that is poorly written such that it takes longer to work with. This is more a problem with an established software project where somebody's coming in afterwards, but this will affect estimates because a developer may come in and say, oh, I've done this sort of task before, it takes me 10 hours. But they don't anticipate that the software is going to be much more difficult to work on because of its legacy of poor code. I don't want to spend too much time about it because I have another presentation, and you can find that presentation on YouTube. I encourage you to look it up. The last one is negotiating estimates. This is something that falls more squarely on the project manager or the client side of the line. So estimates sound a lot like prices. When you come to a developer and ask, how long is it going to take to do this, or how much will it cost, and they say $6,000, that sounds like they're giving you a price for what it's going to take. The same is true if you're using internal developers, because your internal developers make a salary. So if a developer costs you $2,000 a week and they say it takes 3 weeks to get this done, they've effectively given you a price of $6,000. So either way, the calculus is the same. So it's natural as a business person to want to spend as little money as possible. So you may take that estimate and say, well, I don't see why that's going to be so complicated. Can we get this done for $5,000 or maybe $4,000? And you start negotiating on the estimate. Let's look at what's actually happening when you do this by returning to that simple bar graph. At some point, there is an amount of labor it will require to build that task. We don't know what that is. That's why we call an estimate an estimate. But it is a real number. Your developer has given you an estimate. That estimate, based on all the things I've already said in the psychological effects, has a very good likelihood of already being optimistic. When you negotiate on that estimate and say, hey, I'd really like to get this done cheaper, if you push, the developer wants to make you happy, and they're probably going to say, okay, they'll rationalize, maybe there's a way I can get this done a little faster, and they'll bring that estimate down a little bit. But which number have you changed here? Have you changed the labor it's going to take to do the task? No, you've changed the estimate. And so the only thing you've accomplished by negotiating that estimate is increasing your own disappointment at the eventual outcome. So that's an effect I strongly encourage you to try and resist in yourself, is to negotiate with an estimate. Okay, so the second major category of budget surprises is scope creep. The amount that this can surprise you ranges from very little, if you keep it under control, to very large. This is where we've seen some projects spend many multiples of what their original estimate was. And this ultimately comes down to the project you built is not the project you originally planned. So let's talk about the factors that go into scope creep. I'm going to make a group called specifications problems. So the first one is unwritten assumed specifications. This is more a problem with first-time product owners and first-time startup owners. This is where you have some set of ideas of how you think the site is going to work, and you write down what you think those ideas are, and it turns out that there are things you assumed, like if we build X, well, obviously that means Y is included, but it was such an implicit assumption it never hit the paper. So this is a problem of communication between the product owner and the developer. And that can result in the developer building something that's much smaller than you thought, and more importantly, when they make the estimate up front, the estimate is smaller because they didn't know about that extra assumption that you had. I'll give you an anecdotal example of this. A client we were working for a few years ago was doing reviews of products, so users were reviewing products. The products were listed in a taxonomic hierarchy. There was a tree of what kind of product this was, and the products could be listed at multiple places in the taxonomy. Some of those categories that the products were in were very similar, and they were just listed in two because people might look for them in two places. Another place they might be in two categories were very different because a product might serve a couple of very different jobs. And I don't want to go into the details of what they were, but a product could be listed at multiple places on the site. So users left reviews for the products, and we had written this module for user reviews. It was about 3 months old by the time we were going to launch. So we're doing a final review, headed out to launch, and I walked the client through, here's how you leave a review for this product. We'll just review that. And the client said, oh, but which category is that a review for? Because what if I wanted to review it differently for how it addresses a different category? That had, to that point, never been stated. That's a very much more complicated data model, and at that point we estimated it would have taken about an additional $20,000 to build into their product, and it would have delayed launch by another month. So we had to leave that out entirely. And that is, exactly an example of something they had assumed you'd review a product differently for different categories, but they had never stated that, and we had assumed you'd not. So that kind of communication breakdown can damage your estimates, and when you do adopt the change, can result in a lot of scope creep. The second one is added specifications. This is your classic scope creep. So as you are working with your product, your idea people will have new ideas. That's what idea people do, right? And especially, you can envision what a product's going to look like up front on paper, but once you start working with actual software, new things will occur to you. The second major way that new added specifications come in is people responding to user requests. Particularly when you first launch and you first get your software in front of a bunch of users, it's really exciting to get feedback from that first 100 users. And users will do what they'll do. They'll say, it would be great if your product also did this. Also, you know what, I might not use it unless the product did this. When it's those first few, it's easy to add way too much weight and way too much validity to what those users are asking. And we see a significant number of clients who will jump on every new suggestion by a user, and it will suddenly become that week's top new priority. This fades away once you've got thousands of users and you start doing statistics on the features that they request. But there's that 3 or 4 month period where you've only got a few dozen or a few hundred users, and you can easily psychologically latch onto every suggestion that a user makes. Common behavior pattern that we see. The last one is misunderstood constituent needs. So maybe you're building something for generic users out on the web. Maybe you're building a custom product for a small group of people somewhere. But one of the big sources of scope creep between your estimate and what you finally build is misunderstanding what those people want or what those people need. As another anecdote, we were building a software product for an academic institution. This was an administrative data collection tool that a bunch of faculty needed to use. This was one of the best prepared clients we ever had. They showed up with wireframes of every user interface, flowcharts of every user interaction. They even already had a database schema worked out. And they basically plopped down a blueprint and said, this is what we're building, give us an estimate. Even despite the effect I'm about to tell you, they were one of the closest to the estimate we've ever seen. They ended up spending only about 15% more than their original estimate, and that preparation was a big reason for that. But we started building the first version, and we took it to their board, what we had built so far, 2 weeks into the process. One of the senior faculty members raised his hand 3 minutes into the presentation and said, I can't attach that data to this record. It needs to be attached to this other record that doesn't exist that then associates to this other record. I can't track it here. I need to track it on a more finely grained characterization of the data that we're collecting. Our eyes went wide, and the administrator who was running the task started to debate it with them, and pretty quickly we had a whole new specification. So despite all that preparation, the problem is they hadn't put their user flows and their user interfaces in front of the people who were going to use them. Because if they had done that early, they would have caught this particular problem, and it could have been taken into account in the estimate. As it was, it added about 15% to the cost of their project when we had to rework it for that. Fortunately, we caught it early. If we had caught it 4 months in, it would have been a much more expensive problem. All right, second category of scope creep are what I call management failures. There are 2 here, and these are the truly expensive ones. These are where a project goes from what you expect to 5 or 6 times what you expect. The first one is too many pivots. Pivots are an unfortunate fact of life. If the market changes under you and your old business model is no longer correct, you have to pivot. It's going to be expensive, you're going to throw out software, you're going to write new things. There's nothing you can do about it, other than be sure that you really need it. But we do see a pattern where people latch on to new ideas and pivot repeatedly before they ever finish any one completed piece of software. If you're considering a software project, I would encourage you to look inside yourself and try and evaluate if you will be that kind of person, because you are not going to ever meet your budget if you pivot too often. One of the most common places this happens is discussions with people who might give you money. If you're out fundraising, you're talking to VC, you're talking to angels, those people are smart people and they're going to give you ideas. If your response to every angel who says, you know what, this might be a better project and we might even fund it if it was doing this, is for you to turn around and do that, you're going to get a different response from each person who has a different set of ideas, and pretty quickly you're building 6 different products in a row, and that will be enormously expensive. You need to balance the excellent suggestions from experienced fundraisers and startup advisors with some ability to stay the course and hold a rudder. The last one is when revisions meet perfectionism. You can tweak anything as long as you want. You can spend as much time as you want fixing the fonts, fixing the layout, changing the user interface, optimizing the performance. But the longer you do this, the more you are racking up costs. Particularly in the early stages of a startup, you have to be able to make compromises, and you have to say this feature is good enough as it stands and move on. Because what many people are not aware of when they are revising is that that is keeping them from getting to other features, or is keeping them from getting to a launch. And those are much larger costs than you realize. All right, last thing, the endpoint fallacy. So this is much simpler. This comes down to, well, surprise range can vary because, well, you'll see when I explain. But it comes from a misconception of software projects as if they are physical products. Many people will treat a software project as if they are buying a thing, and it has a price, and there's a point at which they've bought that thing. So, just going to put it simply, the only time a software product is done is when your company has failed. When you enter a software startup, expect to continue to spend money on the software indefinitely as long as you are succeeding. Any estimate that you get then is not a total, because there is no total. Development is ongoing. An estimate is for a milestone. So don't mistake a milestone for an endpoint. This is something we see fairly frequently. People come in and say, well, what will it cost to get to our first launch? Or what will it cost to get to our minimum viable product? We'll lay out the features we think that includes and give an estimate of what we think that costs, and people will budget for that and not be prepared to run with a software product that's going to need to continue to iterate and continue to bring on new users. Okay, so everybody, you relax for a minute, because that's the end of the doom and gloom portion of the presentation. Those are the things that go wrong. Let's talk about what we can do about them. And the good news is that for most of them, there are things you can do about them. I almost prepared a slide with a little graph of impact of each of these things versus the degree to which you control it, and it got ugly, and I didn't think it was very useful. Some of the ones you can't control as well are unexpected technical surprises and truly necessary pivots when the marketplace changes under you because a new competitor shows up or a new technology shows up. There's less you can do about those, but a lot of these other problems you can control. So, I'm going to give you 6 things to do. The first is to use some sort of Agile software process. I don't mean capital A Agile. You don't need a certified Scrum Master. If you don't know the difference between a chicken and a pig, I'm not worried about that. What I care about is that you're not diving in on a single plan, doing a single estimate, treating that as a product, and expecting that to be the end of the budgeting story. What you need to do is iterate, run short iterations, and repeat your financial review at every iteration. You're trying to see how far you have gotten so that you are budgeting based on empirical, historical data of how your business is performing. That is how you beat all those estimation fallacies, is you look at real progress. What have we done and what did that cost us, and use that to predict future success. Rapid iteration is the solution to that. As much as you can, try to make your business calculus burn rate versus growth metrics, not amount we've spent versus our total budget. This gets to that endpoint fallacy, right? You are building an ongoing product, and at some level you need to accept that you're going to continue to spend money and measure, are we growing enough to be able to afford to spend what we need to do to keep our users? Obviously, at the beginning of a project, pre-launch, pre-revenue, you are going to have some level of budget, and you need to get a certain amount of things done before that. But you want to shift to the calculus in the second point as soon as you can, because that's going to be a more correct model of an ongoing software project. All right, number 2, this may seem obvious to business people, but have a project manager, right? Project manager's job is to decide what gets done and what doesn't get done. So it's very important that they are empowered to veto features, to make the difficult decisions. We have seen clients who have hired a project manager and then overridden everything the project manager said, at which point, why are you paying them? Their job is to keep the project on task. This means they can't be the idea person. An idea person, no matter how smart they are, is invested in their ideas, and they are compromised in their ability to make difficult decisions about those ideas. So the project manager's job is to take the ideas that are there and decide what can get done. Now, you may be thinking there are a lot of really small startups, and some of you may work for companies of 30 or 40 people, and this is old hat to you and obvious, but there are a lot of people who are 1, 2, 3 people who are starting a web startup together. And if they have 5 or low 6 figures of money, they probably can't afford to hire a separate product manager. So we often end up helping them because if you're working with developers who have done this a lot, developers may have the experience to help you with this. But a developer is not perfect for this either, because certainly a contract developer at least is responding to you, the client, and ultimately, at the end of the day, what the client says is gospel. You have to build the things that the client asks. So a developer is compromised in this ability to make vetoes. Nonetheless, it can be a stopgap measure if that's the budget that you have. The next person you need is a product manager. Now this means different things to different people, but the way I mean it here is a product manager is the person whose job it is to write clear specifications for each feature you're including in your project. They write these down, they communicate them to the developers. They need to have done this before. If you're an idea person, this is your first startup, you're not going to do a good job at this. You are going to make that assumption fallacy and assume that features are included that you have not clearly written down. Somebody who has experience is going to help a lot there. In fact, I would say if you can't find somebody with experience, you should reevaluate whether you're in the right position to do a startup. It's possible for this to be the idea person, so long as the idea person has experience in evaluating their own assumptions and writing clear and complete specifications. This can't be the developer, because this person's job is to give the developer clear specifications. So by the time the developer's trying to write it, that information has already not been conveyed to them. They're, again, trying to read your mind and guess what it is you really want. So if you have those two people on board, and they have empowerment and experience, that's going to do a lot to control all of those effects that I described earlier. The next is understand your constituents' needs. It seems like it's obvious, but a remarkable number of people will dive into software products with an idea, build the first version, and then put it in front of people. That's the wrong order. You want to involve your users early and often, starting from before you build a single line of code. Starting from before you write your wireframes and your user flows. Talk about your idea to your users, see what they think. Write some user flows and some wireframes, put those in front of your users. Write an interactive wireframe with a tool like Acture and watch users go through using it and see if they're finding the tools they need to find and if it makes sense to them. Start building things, and every couple of weeks put what you've built in front of the users. That feedback is the most important thing to keep you from planning to build things that aren't what you need. Right, so don't guess, test. Put it in front of your users all the time. Number 5, use a planning tool and use it correctly. One of the things that I think is most important in a software planning tool is that it gives you a way to estimate the complexity of tasks that is not in dollars and is not in hours. The reason is because we have very strong psychological associations with both those quantities, right? If a developer looks at a task and says, you know what, I can code that in 15 minutes, they're never going to tell you that that'll cost $650, because that would be absurd. But what the developer is forgetting when they're making that calculation is all the other things that go into getting that deployed. It may take them 15 minutes to code, but they also have to test it. They have to deploy it. They have to get it reviewed by the client. Those reviews, if they have changes or revisions, those need to get implemented. It needs to be retested, passed through QA again, deployed again, finally approved, and then deployed into production. By the time all that has happened, the 15 minutes of coding is a very small slice of that feature, and it could very well be a $650 task. So you want to make it so that people are not thinking about money, or for salaried employees, not thinking about hours when they're calculating the total budget impact of a feature. So what you do is you use a planning tool that estimates in any other abstract metric. We use one that estimates in points, where a feature costs from 1 to 8 points. Some people use t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large, extra large. You use these to evaluate the cost of software features, and then you have a team leader in the developer side estimate all new features based on comparison of complexity to past features. You know what, we called this one a 3-point feature last time, this is pretty similar, we'll call it a 3-point feature this time. Then, at a different time or even a different person, you look at past iterations and you see what was the total spend per point. That separates money from estimation, and you end up getting a much more accurate estimate because you're not forgetting all the things that might go into the final dollar cost of a feature. A little anecdote here, we recently did a whole set of new features for a client. We'd been working for them for about a year. They went into beta testing, didn't need much new software for about 6 months, and then came back after beta testing and said, you know what, based on our user feedback, we need this long list of features. So We went through and points estimated every single feature. There were like 20 of them. And the team leader of the project did that, and then she passed it off to me, and I did the math without second guessing her points estimates. I did the math of what had points cost historically over this entire project, for the entire first year of the project. We multiplied those two values together. We told the client it was going to cost $17,500 to build this set of features. The end result when we finished them was $17,200. It was one of our most accurate estimates ever. So I have become a much stronger believer in this as a result of that experience. We're now doing it for a new set of features for the same client, and it looks like we're not going to be quite as close as that one was, but much closer than you might expect estimates to be. The other important thing for your planning tool is never revise a task after an estimate has been made for it. So a common fallacy is you write down, we've got this feature, it's going to cost this many points. We get in development, and when the client looks at it, or when the product manager looks at it, they say, you know what, it would be nicer if it did it this way. Or maybe we can add this change as well. As soon as you have made changes to the specification, you've completely invalidated the estimate, and you've wrecked the ability of the tool to help you predict your budget. It's very important that you make changes by making new tickets so that they can get independently estimated. Don't change specification once an estimate has happened. Finally, evaluate all your ideas with business metrics. So this is important anyway, right? This is a good business practice in general, but I'm going to talk about the effect it will have on scope creep. So for every new idea you're considering, whether it comes internally or from a user, and this is my last point, so yeah, because we just crossed 30 minutes. So, will this idea convert enough new users to be worth the amount I'm going to spend on it? If I think this is going to cost me $5,000 or $8,000, will it bring in enough new users to make enough revenue to be worth having spent that on it? Secondarily, if this is something we're including before a launch, right? So let's add this feature because we really want the site to be perfect before we put it in front of users. Remember that that delay is lost sales, right? Every week that you don't get your site out is a week's worth of potential users who never found your site in the first place, and it's a guaranteed lost sale. So it better be adding enough at the time you do launch to make up for the losses you've already had by adding that. So those are good ideas anyway from business evaluation of your software, but what you will find is that when you evaluate ideas on these metrics, you include fewer of them. Because a lot of other things you realize, oh, we thought that would be nice to have, but we didn't really demonstrate with business fundamentals that it's worth putting in our site. When you include fewer new ideas, you contain your scope growth or your scope creep. So with that, a big thank you to all of you, and let's take some questions.
So from a consumer point of view of development services, what about using using the fixed price contract to reduce my risk on scope creep?
So that's going to be a negotiation with your developer, and I could do a whole different talk on incremental or hourly pricing versus a fixed cost. What you're going to find from a developer is that in order to give you a fixed cost, they're going to want a fixed feature set, right? So otherwise, all you're doing is you're offloading the risk of the scope creep to the developer, which isn't going to make them happy either. What I would suggest is that it is really hard to do contemporary software development with a fixed feature set because you need to be able to respond to changing market conditions. As you get user feedback, you need to be able to add new specifications. If you've negotiated a fixed price for a fixed feature set, now you have to go back and redo those negotiations when you add a new feature. So effectively, you're issuing change orders all the time, and you end up spending a very large fraction of your time in price negotiations as opposed to getting the task done. Some developers work that way. Our company doesn't have a strict rule against it, but we do it very, very rarely, like not at all in the last 5 years, kind of rarely. But yeah, maybe we should have a separate conversation about it afterwards.
Good morning, my name is Mati. I had a question with regards to security vulnerabilities, especially like newly discovered ones. Heartbleed really sucked a lot of our time out in our IT groups. So how do we deal with that and from a budgeting and contracting point of view? Because it's Seems pretty open-ended.
Yeah, so security vulnerabilities pop up on a semi-regular basis. You can expect in any particular piece of technology, you can expect a couple per year, maybe even 3 or 4. Some of them are going to be much worse than others, Heartbleed being an example. What I would suggest doing is, well, you could count on a ticketing system simply accounting for the fact that that's going to reduce your velocity. The number of points of features you get done per unit time over time will be a little lower because of the release of security vulnerabilities that you have to spend time fixing. Unfortunately, they don't happen often enough for you to see that within a couple of iterations. You'll only see that over a year or 2. So another approach might be to budget items in your planning system that says, all right, here's a 5-point ticket for the inevitable security failure that happens this 6 months. And so you're budgeting for it on that level. But it's a difficult problem. I don't have any perfect solution for it. Yes?
Tom Linzo, consultant. How do you deal with things on the client end, such as incompetence, politics, egos? 30 years of hardware and software projects, that's one thing I've seen has always screwed us over.
That question puts me in an interesting position. We have a vetting process for new clients, and we try pretty hard to work primarily with clients who have their heads on straight. We see that they've done their planning, they have some experience with the business, they're not completely fresh to this, and that helps reduce that effect somewhat. And then really the answer is if you get somebody who's not making the right decisions, you try to help them make the right decisions. And beyond that, you just do your best. But there will always be some projects that don't work out well because someone somewhere is making ill-advised business decisions. Yeah.
Hi, Michelle. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about sort of the ongoing relationship, like after the product is already up and running, and what to expect from that if you're running a small thing and you sort of need that ongoing development support.
Right. So it's going to depend a bit, in case people couldn't hear that, she was asking about how do you evaluate ongoing development and ongoing relationship. You'll find some software firms who don't do ongoing work. They will build the first version of your product and then it's your problem. And they don't do maintenance because maintenance is a trickier management problem. How you handle it depends on the kind of project that it is. So typical web startups need to iterate continuously, and really ongoing maintenance is no different from early development, other than that you have something in production and you're now deploying new features to it regularly. So this is your Facebook, your Pinterest, or much smaller, similar things. They're constantly adding new features. And so really maintenance isn't any different than any other development. There are other products of a more fixed scope that maybe need to make some tweaks as users make requests. An example might be some kind of an e-commerce site. So they're selling something, and once you've built the shopping cart and the product catalog and this sort of thing, you're more or less done. In those situations, development tends to drop off pretty sharply, starting maybe 2 or 3 months after launch. Those first couple of months are when you're going to find a lot of bugs, you're going to get a lot of user feedback, but those products do tend to reach something of a plateau where their feature set is a little more fixed. I would say in that kind of project, if you're working with a contractor, you can usually discuss with them having some sort of maintenance plan or even just continuing to use whatever hourly system they were using before, and you're just using fewer of those hours. In the case of a bigger web startup where development really just never stops, and in fact probably grows if you're a successful web startup and you're still growing, there will definitely be a point where you have enough revenue and you'll want to transition off of contractors and into an internal house, because when things are running months and years, internal developers are going to be less expensive in the long run. So does that answer your question? It really depends on the kind of project, what's going to happen after launch.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm a mobile app developer. My question is, do you recommend any planning software or ticketing software that you like?
We do almost everything with Pivotal Tracker, is our favorite. It's not a perfect system, but it's one that we've gotten very comfortable with, and we've been able to do some pretty accurate estimating with for our clients. There are plenty of other good ones out there. I know there are people who are a big fan of Jira. I know other people who really don't like it. We could talk afterwards about potential ones, but our company mostly uses Pivotal Tracker.
Evan, this is really, Scott Witt. This is really good stuff, and I think everybody should go back and watch the video and take good notes because you're making excellent points. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was you mentioned, you need to look at metrics, business metrics, make good business decisions. Could you look back historically and think about successful projects and unsuccessful projects and what the makeup of the team or the client looked like? So what kind of business people did they have, what kind of experience did they have versus were they all technologists?
Right. Well, historically, we've worked with a lot of clients that were small, because it's small clients that tend to go to contractors because they don't have the budget to hire, 6 internal developers. And so many of those people were on their first or second startup, and some of them, even though they were on their first or second startup, were relatively successful. I would say the ones that were successful that had very little experience were highly coachable. They were willing to listen to advisors, both what their developers were telling them and what external funding sources were telling them. They're willing to incorporate that advice. Among the people who were experienced, who were successful, were the ones who explicitly involved those two roles I mentioned, a project manager and a product manager. So we have seen people who are on their third or fourth startup, and as a result of having a couple of successes in the past, are convinced that they by themselves can do all of it. And this tends to be the cases where you have a rudderless idea person who continually innovates and is changing direction all the time and never reaches anything that's finished and launchable. Does that answer the question? Okay. Thank you.
Got one last question.
Great, thank you. So I have a question. So in a modern, agile, iterative, build, measure, learn type of setup, right? As a business owner, I'm fundamentally interested in hitting my growth metrics, making sure that I learn and I pivot properly. It seems like the software outsourcing world is still based on fixed price or time and materials, right? Is there any innovation coming out of software development that says how can we come up with models that are incentive aligned, that can actually address how businesses are getting built? So
I'm a little confused about the question. You said the software contracting world is based on an old model, and then you cited fixed price and time and materials, which are both different models.
So I understand. So what I'm saying is there anything, so let me be more direct, is there anything in the software outsourcing world that better reflects what owners are trying to do with lean startup, for instance?
Right. Well, I would point to Agile as a comparatively new innovation. At this point, it's about 15 years old, so it's not super new, but it definitely is better than an old, fixed plan model. Trying to think if there are other new innovations. There's things like extreme programming that has appeared, but that's not here. Okay.
On the software contracting side, right? Is there something that better allows me to align my interests, which is performance metrics, with the software developer shop?
Right. I'm not aware of any particular innovation along those lines, but I'd love to have a conversation with you afterwards to make sure we're talking on the same level.
Yeah, Pat, and Mike, thanks for the last question. The elephant in the room is offshore resources, and that's a whole other talk. But can you just touch on that a little bit as far as how that adds risk to these projects and how you manage those risks if you use offshore resources?
So the big challenge with offshore resources is estimating the quality of their output. I want to make it very clear, people offshore are no less intelligent and no less skilled at software. The challenge is that a lot of the offshore companies, particularly the ones who are doing a lot of marketing, are pulling people right out of school who are inexperienced and don't have many experienced people on the team, because the experienced people in those countries and cities are building their own startups. And so when you go to an offshore firm and it's not somebody you can meet in person, you don't really know the experience and management skill level of the people that you're working with. And so this is where we've seen a lot of cases where clients are looking to reduce their costs and have gone offshore, and then they end up with people who are charging a low hourly rate, but they're delivering low quality software that we often have to spend a lot of time fixing when it comes in. The cases where I've seen offshore work be more successful is places that have captive and groomed offshore teams. So the company has a person on site in Mexico or in Singapore that has trained a specific team and vetted those people. So you know it's not churn and a bunch of new people coming in all the time. You know it's a group of people who work only for you, who are trained on your software and have a couple of years or more experience in doing it. Those are the cases where I've seen offshore projects be more successful or more successful as part of the equation. So I would look for people who have those kinds of teams.
Have you integrated offshore with your work?
We don't offshore our own work, just as a matter of course. We have worked in 5 or 6 cases where a client we are working for hired their own offshore talent and asked us to manage them. Most of those cases did not go well, and that's part of why we do everything with in-house sources ourselves. But I know of some other contracting firms who have their own, as part of the contracting firm, offshore team that is lower cost. And those, I think, are likely to have greater success. But it tends to be bigger contracting firms that can afford that.
Thank you, Evan. So at the end of your talk, during your talk, you actually gave us a lot of really good, helpful insights. We have a room full of 100+ innovators here in Pasadena. We're in a great co-working space. Is there anything that us as a group can do to help you?
To help me?
Yep.
You know, mostly I just like to network and meet people.
Okay, great.
You know, we've been in Pasadena for a while, and I don't know the Pasadena business world as well as I would like to. And so, you know, come up and talk to me. That's really the most important thing.
Thank you, Evan. So afterwards, you'll be available to chat with everybody in the room?
Absolutely, I'll stick around as well.
And I like doing these selfie pictures, so if you can come stand here real quick, and we'll post this up. All right, everybody in the back, let's get you to photobomb this. All right, you ready? Your marks, get set, go. That wasn't very exciting. Come on. Come on. Where's the... All right, your marks, get set, go.